In tonight's Dorchester segment, we have an update on a local challenger for Congress, a costly scam for a civic group, and concerns about a waterfront development plan. And to share the details, we'd like to welcome the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Of course, Chris.
One Dorchester resident, Ayanna Presley, she's challenging Mike Capuano for Congress. Before, we were thinking of this two competitive points here, or could there be a wave?
I mean, that's the thing. That's always the question. Right after the Bronx 14th win for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, suddenly everyone is looking for parallels. Everyone's looking for a potential route for challengers to take out longtime incumbents. So I caught up with both Congressman Capuano and City Councilor Ayanna Presley this week, and they pointed out that even though there is kind of a push for new blood, they both noted that there are some pretty significant differences between the races. So even though you have a younger woman of color challenging a white male incumbent, and specifically a long-time male incumbent, Joe Crowley in the Bronx 14th seemed to many to be pretty checked out of the race, actually. He chose not to debate his 28-year-old challenger, and for a lot of his constituents, they felt that he was a little bit divorced from the community that he was supposed to be serving, even though, again, there's a similarity where both districts have become increasingly diverse over the time of the incumbent holding the seat. Whereas both Ayanna Presley and Congressman Capuano point out is, I think as Presley put it, he's not asleep at the switch. He remains a very active challenger. It's been competitive from the start. But when people ask about a wave, what they tend to be looking at is the way that both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Presley have been framing their campaigns, where they're laying claim to the grassroots title for it. They aren't taking any money from political action committees, for instance, and they're trying to make their case that what they are offering is not a different vote on a number of specific items, but the idea that they would be bringing new voices with them to the federal arena, and it's been pretty interesting to watch the response to that, especially in districts where there hasn't been a challenger in a very long time.
You know, being completely objective here, I guess one thing that also gives us suspense. This might be the first time in a long time that Capuano has been challenged rather, by someone who is at least fairly high profile, an actual office holder within his own party.
And well, it's actually his first primary challenge from a Democrat. He was challenged by an independent before, and I believe at one point there might have been a Republican. But he's been in office. This is his 10th term that he's serving right now, and I asked him about it. Are there any changes to what you're doing? Because as you note, Ayanna Presley is not a newcomer. She was the first woman of color ever elected to the Boston City Council in 2009. So she's served for 9 years in office in a competitive race every single time. You have to defend your seat, and she's topped the ticket 3 of those times since her first election. But Capuano says that while, of course, he's paying attention to it, there's a steady drumbeat of things that he needs to deal with on the national level always, whether or not there's actually a candidate. So he's been out and about on the Mexican border, for instance, dealing with the Trump family separation policy, and has really been kind of pushing for that and trying to keep immigration on the front burner. And of course, that's also a primary area of interest for Ayanna Presley, but she tends to focus a little bit more on how, for instance, the displaced communities that might be in Massachusetts are reacting to it specifically, because she's still looking at it from a ground-up, local to federal lens.
We have an established civic group in Dorchester going back at least to the 1970s, if not earlier. The Columbia Savin Hill Civic Association, they got caught in an email scam. What did that do to them?
Yeah, so back in January, so this was found out in a recent July 5th, I believe, letter that was sent out to the civic community. So the Columbia Savin Hill Civic Association, it's, a staple civic association in Dorchester. As the name would suggest, it covers most of Savin Hill, all the way out into Columbia Point. And they, in January, were the targets of an email scam where their treasurer received an email from someone who appeared to be, but was not, the president of the Civic Association, Desmond Rohan. And it said, we need you to make a withdrawal for something. It had something to do with a grant, a potential grant. And so she sees this thing that looks like it came from the president, goes, okay, withdraws it. And then over the course of just the next month, so this all happened in January, this person on the email followed up 3 more times and said, there are additional fees associated with this. We need more of these. And so she actually approved 4 different wire transfers from their actual account to unknown accounts. And that in and of itself makes it kind of a tricky situation where it's not like someone walked into a bank and stole the money. The treasurer of the Civic Association signed off on it. So it looks like they're trying to navigate whether they need to subpoena all of the receiving banks. The police are seeing if they can trace the email. But again, this was back in January, so it might not still be active. So right now they're trying to fundraise to kind of close the gaps, but they were taken ultimately for $11,000 plus.
Another topic here, plans for a waterfront development in Port Norfolk. This is sort of a sleepy, insular neighborhood near Neponset Circle, and you say it's massive. I guess people are worried about that.
Yeah, it's very, very large, this project. It was floated back last year that people initially saw the plans for it. And at the time they were proposing, this is a South Boston-based development group, they were proposing at the very tip of the Port Norfolk Peninsula, they wanted to put in a boutique hotel, a potential restaurant, and more than 100 different units of residences at the end of a street that has only, or at the end of a port that has only 3 different access roads, 2 of which are one way. And that was met with understandable alarm from the people who were living there on that port at the time. And the size of the project has gone down quite a bit, and it's now just a residential project. But they're in the middle of having 3 different city-sponsored meetings to discuss it, where they're focusing on the environmental impacts of something of that size going in at the port. It's around 90-some units at this point. For instance, how any access routes would be affected, whether or not it's going to turn what's already kind of, as you know, a slippery situation on Morrissey Boulevard right around Neponset into an even worse one if you add more cars. And on Monday, there's actually a 3rd meeting that's going to look at the actual design of the project, because there's a lot of trepidation from the residents that it feels like the way these meetings have been held for them takes for granted that they're okay with a big change in use from just a marina, which is there now, to a big residential project. So it feels like that'll probably come to a head on Monday.
Another concern in another part of Dorchester is about slowing down traffic, part of the city's Slow Streets program. Tell us about that.
So the Neighborhood Slow Streets program kicked off 2 years ago with just 2 little trial balloons sort of areas. It was at about the same time as the city was working to bring the speed limit all across the city down from 35. And so these slow streets areas, and now we've made it through the first round of them that are in the middle of meetings at the moment, are designed to basically offer a bespoke traffic calming mitigation for all of these small areas of Dorchester, and Grove Hall and Chinatown is a really big area, where you had something like 47 different little pocket communities that applied last year to say, traffic is really bad in this very specific way in our neighborhood, or we notice that people keep parking in these really weird areas, and can you do anything to help us? So I caught up with the West of Washington Coalition last week, which is a little area that's actually attached to the Talbot-Norfolk Triangle, which had been one of the pilot programs. And they said, look, we've been watching what's been happening over at Talbot-Norfolk. They've added some speed bumps, they've improved signage, they've messed around with the curbs a little bit, and that actually impacts our little area as well. So they were kind of tacked on there as a separate little 12-block radius. But it's an area that has severe traffic problems. There was a young man who was killed on a bicycle just a few years ago at one of their worst intersections. So what they're really focusing on right now is kind of going through the Boston 311 system to ask for new street signs or new crossings. And as this project rolls along for them in this round, they're hoping to kind of set the plate really well for the city to ultimately come in and see where do we need to mess with some roadways. So the new round of applications is actually open for this next season. All of them are due in by August 24th, I believe it is, and it basically involves explaining your case to the city, getting recommendations from local officials, and talking about that one corner that really has been a nightmare for you guys.
I want to ask you about a couple of events coming up pretty soon. One is along the river, an area that's been repurposed from some of the bad old days on the Neponset River. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the Neponset River Fest is an annual event that kind of celebrates the reclaiming over time of Dorchester's waterfront. There's kayaking. It's basically just a big party out on the waterfront near some of the beaches that have been reclaimed, and that's this Saturday, and it's always kind of a great show. Especially last year, it corresponded with the mayor announcing his re-election run, but this year it's free and clear. Get out to the Neponset River. It's going to be great.
And another event in Everett Square, and Everett, of course, has been upstaged by another work of public art.
Yeah.
What's planned for that?
So it's near the Everett Square, which is really interesting. So if you're familiar at all with one of two things, either the Blake House, which is one of Boston's oldest historic properties, or the really, really big bronze pear that you see as you're going by Everett Square, it's actually a reference to some of the famous old pears of Dorchester, which brings us to what's happening next Saturday, which is the first ever Pear Square Arts Fair. And it's basically going to be a public arts fair. There's going to be musical performances, art, food, just kind of an effort to bring awareness to an underused square that's kind of one of the staple intersections of the city. And that's something that the Dorchester Historical Society, for instance, is very excited about.
And finally, I know this is on the fringe of Dorchester, but it's one of the two municipal golf courses that are going to be in the spotlight. And these are former stepchildren as far as golf is concerned. So what's going to be happening?
Yeah, so Boston has these really great municipal golf courses. So they're city-owned, they're open to the public. And so you've got the William J. Devine golf course in Franklin Park, and you've got the George Wright golf course in Hyde Park. And these guys had kind of been underused for quite a while, but the city rediscovered these local gems, put in the work, refurbished them, and really, really worked to make sure that these are interesting courses that match the areas where they're actually existing in. And they were this week, and still are up until tomorrow, Friday, the site of the Massachusetts State Amateurs Championship. So on Monday, you had a whole host of golfers come in for the first day of trials, and they've been pretty much having them throughout the week. So tomorrow, you're going to see the top 4 golfers that are going to be playing in Hyde Park just to see who walks away with that title.
Thank you very much for being with us. And finally, Jennifer, if people want to find out more, you've got the website, you've got your own Twitter feed. What should they go to?
Yeah, so if you want to learn about any of that, even just checking in on the calendar, we're at .news.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at .news, or me at jen.smith.
All right, thank you very much. Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter.